In this video, I'm going to talk about a subject that I've addressed in my writing a few times and that seems to come up again and again in a lot of different ways as symptomatic of the problems of liberalism, Enlightenment, political philosophy in general, which is that it takes for its ideals what are really means to an end, misunderstanding the true essence of society, which is the pursuit of the good and a shared vision of the good, and substituting for that, or sort of abandoning that ideal because, out of a modern cynicism, which says that we're never going to agree on the good and therefore shouldn't try to agree on the good and shouldn't try to cooperate and shouldn't try to engage in this collective pursuit of the good life and truth. And we're never going to agree on that. And so we'll just abandon all of that and take a more individualistic approach to political philosophy and therefore idealize values like liberty, freedom, which is a purely negative value and is really just a context in which the good can be pursued, but is never the end in itself. So what happens when you idolize anything is that it sort of inverts or boomerangs back on you and can, in many cases, give you the opposite. If you idolize food, you enjoy food less. And in fact, it can cease to nourish you and can make you sick and kill you. So when you get your values out of order, they can actually destroy you. And so I'm going to say that idolizing liberty, making liberty the end all be all of political values, actually enables tyranny. And for this, I'm going to talk about universal suffrage because it's a good point to illustrate how this works, how this actually happens and has happened in modern civilization. Universal suffrage is the extension of the right to vote to all classes. So when you hear about suffrage, women's suffrage was the rights of women to vote. So universal suffrage was the allowing all classes, all people, access to the voting booths, and with the presumed control and empowerment that came with that. So that was the idea, was to make everyone freer and give people more control over their destinies, more control over the operations of government. Did it work that way? No, it did not. But it was held out that way as a new privilege. So by holding out to the people a new privilege, the right to vote, it actually became possible in the background and without anyone noticing to put in place a radical new responsibility. So kind of a bait and switch type of thing. And along with this revolutionary privilege that no peasant, that those poor peasants from back in the day, they never would have had with the right to vote, what was actually smuggled in was a new responsibility, a new duty that no peasant population would have ever so readily accepted. So by holding out a right that no one in history has ever had, the average man, the man on the street, actually got a new responsibility that no one else in history ever had and never would have accepted, had it been clearly stated. And that was the duty to wage war. Because with few exceptions, and in fact we'll just say with historical exceptions that really just prove the rule, the duty to wage war was not the responsibility of the peasant, the person, and the average man on the street. It was the role of the governing class, the ruling class, the nobility, the knights, and maybe a small professional soldier class, and the population at large really only got involved if the enemy was literally at the gate, in which case, they might have a responsibility as a local militia to defend them, in that case, for very short campaigns, very close to home. And at that point, it's not really an institutional conscription. It's not really a draft, social responsibility. It's more, the barbarians are literally outside of our village, and so, what are we going to do? Just die? And so that's not really the same thing as saying that everyone wages the wars that the government chooses. So that's why what the point here is that right along the same time that everyone was given the great privilege of voting and that kind of empowerment, at the same time you see the popularization, the universal implementation of conscription. So conscription is another term that we don't want to talk about suffrage anymore. We talk about voting rights. We don't really talk about conscription anymore. We talk about the draft. So conscription is the draft. Whenever you see that in history books, they're talking about forced, compulsory military service. So we don't understand this usually, but that's a very modern thing. And it comes hand in hand with modern forms of government, democracy, because, again, prior to that, it would not have sold. Of course, once you convince people that they have this wonderful right, that they're empowered, then of course it's going to be much easier to convince them that, well, since we gave you the reins of government, you're a ruler now. I guess it's your responsibility to fight and defend, and since the government's choices are your choices, then you want this war. And the people, of course, eat it up, because if they didn't, then they might have to question whether the government's choices were really their choices. So it's a difficult psychological situation. But to kind of back up the claim that this really was a new thing that was shocking to some people, we'll quote Hippolyte Taine, who was observing the situation. And keep in mind, he's talking about the 18th century here, lived in the 19th century. But he wrote, "As war followed war, the burden of conscription has grown heavier. Like a slow contagion, it has spread from state to state until now the whole of continental Europe is in its grip. There it holds court along with the friend of its youth, its twin brother that always comes just before or after universal suffrage. Both of them brought to birth at about the same time, the one bringing in its train more or less openly and completely the other, both of them blind and terrible guides or masters of the future, the one placing in the hands of every adult person a voting paper, the other putting on his back a soldier's knapsack, the promise which they hold for the 20th century of slaughter and bankruptcy, the exacerbation of hatred and suspicion between nations, the wastage of the work of men's hands, the perversion to base uses of the beneficent discoveries of science, the return to the low and debased shapes of primitive societies on the warpath, the retrograde movement towards a barbarous and intellectual egotism, towards the feelings, manners, and morals of ancient cities and savage tribes. All this we know too well." So that is quite a prophecy, talking about the use of technology that this would lead to, the slaughter. So he's writing before the atrocities of World War I with trench warfare, the technological use of modern weaponry, and before, of course, he talks about science, its use for war, mass war, and, he's writing way before the use of atomic bombs. So, again, we need to emphasize that in traditional civilization, the, quote, privileges of the nobility were linked to the fact that war was their responsibility. They ruled because they fought, and they fought because they ruled. With the rise of democracy, people are told that they can rule too. They are the nobility, or that they have no rulers. And they were so flattered at the idea of participating in government that they hardly noticed this cost. So what do we see today? Men of today, insofar as they are sufficiently patriotic, they go to war when the government calls them. They kill whoever it tells them to kill, die in whatever country happens to have warranted their, quote, deployment. And of course, there's exceptions. There's protesters, but in a significant sense, they're socially despised. If you dodge the draft, what would have been considered tyranny to most past civilizations, you're a coward. So, if we're to judge by the words and actions of the common voter in today's democracy, and we'd have to say that the voter is becoming a little resentful, maybe starting to see the problem, the trickery. Perhaps he's beginning to see that he was swindled and perceive that the promise of self-government is not quite fulfilled. So he votes, but he still feels powerless. He's assured that he calls the shots, but at every turn feels commanded by them. They tell him what to do. They demand his taxes. They start the wars. They make the laws. He cannot, and he can't understand them. Not even sure he can condone them. So it's becoming blatantly clear to the voter that the ballot sheet he's allowed to sign every 4 years was perhaps not really worth the sacrifice, not worth the knapsack on his back. He wonders if the state is permitting him to vote, who, in permitting him to vote, came out far better in the deal. And he's a little skeptical, more or less, that in the end, does his vote even matter? He doesn't feel very empowered like he did back in the early days of the Enlightenment, application of Enlightenment theory, when everyone was super enthusiastic about these rights. But he certainly feels it, when he gets shot in the trench and is starving. Universal suffrage was a devil's bargain, and it's always signaled the establishment of conscription. Yeah, in the days of kingship, it's true, men couldn't vote. Neither could they be pressed into any kind of extensive military campaign. They could be pressed into something like the militia, which we've already talked about, campaigns lasting 30 days. We have examples of that. But that's an entirely different order than today, where men can be drawn up by generations, by the lottery, by millions, from land masses the size of a continent, for years at a time on the opposite side of the globe, for reasons that are not nearly as obvious as when you've got, the barbarians at the gate. So, we'd say to the peasant, you may have a hand in governing your fellows and yourself like the aristocrat, but you have to also fight like the aristocrat. And the peasant accepts it, but before long, it becomes obvious. The new peasant ruler, which is what we are, peasant rulers, mock rulers, is allowed to fight and die like the aristocrat of old. But, we die wondering whether or not we ever really got to govern ourselves, much less anyone else. We fulfill our end of the bargain. At least most, patriotic people do, giving themselves up to power when power calls. Did power ever give any of itself up to him? So, all the talk about rights, shared power, self-government, it's rhetoric. The truth is that it's impossible to bestow a right like that, like government, because it's contrary to the nature of reality. Those things are set in stone in the structure of the created world. And you can't just bestow a legal right that overturns that. Really, only duties, the contrary, or the other side of the coin of rights, only duties can be bestowed on a man. And anyone pretending to offer you a right is probably smuggling in a duty in the fine print. And so it'd be more appropriate to speak of things in terms of duties than a government that is only concerned with rights, because then all of the really important stuff is invisible. It's ignored. So in the case of modern regimes, it was conscription, an institution which Jefferson himself called the last of all impressions, that was smuggled in with the right. And that's how it's always gone. Liberalism succeeds by flattery.